We offer, how many people work with the cloud right now? How many people work on, okay, just a few? Good. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the concepts and services we offer. And, virtual machines, cloud services, and websites. So virtual machines, everybody knows what they are, pretty much bare bones servers that you can move around, put in places. Cloud services is something that is a little more managed, and websites is simply a website where you can put your applications and data out there, and it shows up on the web. Everyone knows what a website is. The three things, so basically virtual machines we call infrastructure as a service, because all we're offering you really is just the server. You can put your operating system on it, you can put whatever you want on it, and make it go however you'd like. Platform as a service is something in between, so we actually manage some of the things that go on your server, and then software as a service is completely managed, and all you have to worry about is your apps and your data. So typical packaged software, so we still have the three things here. Packaged software, you'll have all these things these days that are included that need to be a part of your application. And you know, traditionally, systems administrators, network administrators, software vendors, and everybody gets involved and puts those pieces together for you. On Azure, what we have is infrastructure as a service. We still handle virtualization, server storage, and networking. We have these big data centers all over the world, and in 89 countries at the moment that provide these facilities. And then you put your own operating system on, middleware, runtime, applications, data. Java Platform as a Service is something I'm going to show you today. This is, you actually have to manage your middleware, runtime, data, and applications. Everything else is taken care of by Windows Azure. And then Software as a Service, all those things are taken care of by Windows Azure. And you just put your application code and the data that you want to store. Everything else has been decided before that. So, Microsoft Open Technologies, I mentioned, we work with open source, and so these are some of the tools that we work with every day. More than one, quite frequently. By the way, I've got a couple of colleagues with me here. Doug and Martin are in the room as well, and they're colleagues who are here as well. So with us and about 27 other people, it's about 30 of us, work with all these technologies, getting to work on Windows Azure and different devices. Does anyone know, has anyone here heard of VM Depot? See, this is good. So, would you believe this is a site that has been put together by Microsoft Open Technologies. It runs exclusively Linux VMs. So here's some samples. We have Jenkins, Tomcat, we have JRuby, and several others. So what this is an exchange where you can actually create your own virtual machine and publish it out to VM Depot. Anybody can do this. There's no charge for it, and you can share your virtual machines with other people. Right now, I think we have a few hundred virtual machines out there, thousands of downloads, and you can actually download Tomcat on Linux. In this case, it's the Ubuntu 12 version of Tomcat, ready to go. You literally take that Linux virtual machine, put it on a Windows Azure infrastructure as a service site, and you've got Tomcat running on Ubuntu with little to no effort. It typically takes just a little bit of time. Yeah.
Where do we go? VMDepot.com?
It's vmdepot.msopentech.com. So.
You can ping it.
That's probably right here. Wi-Fi's a little slow. There we go. So, a lot of different applications here. You can download them and you can publish your own. There's instructions on the website for publishing your own VHD, Virtual Hypervisor, is it disk? I'm not sure. VHD files that you create on your own and publish up there. And you can also, more commonly, download the ones we have. So let's see what we have for Java. This doesn't show a lot, but we got Node.js, Solar, Jenkins, JBoss, Tomcat, Gitorious, JRuby, something called DevPack you might find interesting as well. It's got Java, PHP, Ruby on Rails, pre-configured, ready to go. All you have to do, like I say, is just download this for free. You put it on Windows Azure. There's charges, obviously, for running it on Windows Azure, but there's no charge for downloading it and setting it up.
What's that mean? We use it ourselves for free but not publish it?
Because it's open source licensing,
Right?
you can use it for free. You can change it and you can publish it. You can basically do what you please with it. We don't actually heavily police what images are out there. We have several people who we work with as partners. For example, does anyone work with Drupal here? A couple people? Okay. Well, Drupal's a web CMS, and it's a popular one, or Joomla, WordPress, that sort of thing. We have partners who have created modules, add-ons for these, for WordPress, Joomla, Drupal, and they could actually include their modules as part of a WordPress or Joomla or Drupal release, put it out there, brand it as their own items, and make it available for downloads. It's another channel for them to find customers for their tools. In this case, they're free tools. Let's see, Drupal.
Can we run and test these images on our own machine before we deploy them?
They do run on Windows. They run in Windows, they're VHD files, they run on Windows machines, and they also run on Windows Azure. So, yes, the answer is yes.
But you're emulating the Linux in there, correct? You're emulating the Linux in there.
They are. They're all on Linux. There's no Windows images out here at all. So it's all Linux. Some people need to get their heads around that Microsoft has a Linux platform out there. But like I say, we're all about open source. We're all about interoperability. We're all about standards. Linux is a standard operating system.
Just to clarify, it's a hypervisor environment. We're not
Yeah.
emulating anything. There happen to be a bunch of Linux images here.
Right.
There's no technical reason you couldn't put a Windows image there. There are licensing reasons you can't start giving away free copies of a Windows image.
Right.
Whereas you can't give away free copies of all these Linux distros. So that's why that's the difference there.
How about Mac OS?
Once again, it's a license. If you can make a deal with Apple to redistribute your stuff on VM Depot, then you'll be able to do it.
My question is, like you could do actually hosting here. What's the pricing? Is it scalable? Is it kind of like Amazon Micro?
Windows Azure has its own pricing. We have different tiers. So we have a micro, we have a small, medium, large, and that all there's different dependencies on memory, disk space. You can do mem caching, all kinds of things, but the pricing is out on the windowsazure.com website, and you'll see it. It's not free to run your items on Windows Azure. There's a 90-day trial, though. Yes?
It looks like a meet-you of AMI exchange from Amazon EC2. Could you describe what's the difference, what the advantages, disadvantages, and can we migrate, let's say, this image to EC2 or import EC2 AMI image on this platform?
Yeah, so AMI is similar. We have less images on ours because we have the most used images. So we've gone for, the 80-20, we've got the 20 on here, the 20 that everyone uses, the other 80% we haven't really put on there. So we have a smaller selection, but maybe quality over quantity. And the other thing is, in terms of compatibility, could you move them to ACS? I don't think that, I'm not sure that they handle VHDs right now. VHD format. VHD is an open format that Microsoft has shared. But I don't think that they have full support for VHDs. So in terms of moving them to Amazon or any other provider, I'm not sure that you can do that right now.
So
I know
you don't
you
support importing from AMI. So I cannot migrate from EC2 to this.
I don't believe so, no. I'll verify that, but I don't think so. It's just Windows servers and Windows Azure you can put it on.
And why would I want to migrate?
I never said you wanted to. You said you wanted to.
I don't know, I'm just curious if I can.
We haven't actually got to the services yet. They were jumping ahead there.
Yeah, we do have services, and obviously you can migrate data and things like that, but that's just like any other migration platform. It's not easy to move things around with that. So I'll get into virtual machines a little bit later, but I just want to show you some of the features. So like I mentioned, someone here has created a Drupal and OData module that you can actually download, and it runs Drupal, it becomes an OData provider instantly, things like that. So, back to this. So that's VM Depot, just a little bit about it. vmdepot.msopentech.com is the website. So the reason why I wanted to show you that was why would we put Linux images out there? Microsoft is all about Windows. Well, Windows Azure is about services. So we are a service provider, or not we, Windows Azure is a service provider, and there are building block services. It's flexible. The pricing is based on usage rather than on dedicated servers. So it shrinks and grows depending on your usage, network, and storage. And we have a 99.95% monthly SLA. And I'll show you some of the features there in a little bit. So some of the building blocks we have, we're working on big data, Hadoop with Hortonworks, for example. We've got databases. We've got NoSQL databases, including MongoDB, CouchDB. We also have our own internal SQL databases. We have blob storage. I'm going to show you a little bit about that later. Different things that you can do. So you can actually build a multi-tier web application all within Windows Azure. You can build a back end on MongoDB, as you saw Jimmy Ray demo last month if you were here at the in Bellevue. And the front end could all be managed and supported on a platform as a service or another virtual machine. We also have caching, messaging, identity, and I'll get into those in a little bit as well. So, Windows Azure Developer Center, what is here for developers? Services, not servers, so we got mobile. Of course, we have .NET APIs. We've got REST protocols and APIs for each one of these things. Node.js, Java, of course, PHP, Python, and some other platforms as well. And here's all the drivers we have. There's a driver download page here that shows you all the different platforms that we have as well.
Those, what, database drivers?
No, these are actually language. So they manage the services and interacting with the platform on Windows Azure and allow you to build your applications on top of storage, on top of operating systems, etc.
So your Python, is that the Iron Python that Microsoft was building? Or is this standard open source Python?
That is a good question.
Standard Python. It's not the Iron Python project.
Okay. So.
And the mobile you have up there, is that the drivers are specifically for your Surface and your mobile phone, or is that
Is that Windows 8 or Windows CE or which one?
There's Windows 8, there's Windows CE, there's also drivers for the Windows Phone platform. There's also Android and iOS.
So is that like a phone gap type of thing?
Not exactly, no. No, it's more support for services, for example, geolocation and things like that. We actually have support built in for mobile applications on the back end. So you don't actually have to build a lot of this stuff. So the idea here is, and this is one of the things I like about this. By the way, I joined Microsoft Open Technologies last November. Previously worked at IBM and Deloitte and a few other places, so I've sort of been around in different places. What I really like about this as a developer is it allows you to build a lot of the applications that you want to build without having to worry about the back-end services, databases, mobile application, geolocation, things like this. That you know, how do you actually build a geolocation app that handles traffic? Well, on the back end of a Windows Azure app, it takes care of a lot of that functionality for you. So it's kind of interesting. So those are some of the drivers that we have. And as I mentioned, by drivers we mean the interaction with the Azure platform, data storage, memory, things like that. So we have a developer center, which is at windowsazure.com. Go to windowsazure.com, click on Developer Center, and these are all the different platforms you have. The Java Developer Center, we actually have a full Java Developer Center. And let me go to that one. I have it here. Huh. I did, but I got rid of it. Come on.
Superior.
Oh, thank you. Can't see it from here. Eyes are going. Wi-Fi is a little slow here. So, oops. There's a community. It's not. Support. Must be.
That's under documentation.
Documentation? Thanks. Developer centers. Hey, okay. So you go to Java. I had this up before, but the screen's kind of small. It doesn't all fit in. But the idea here is you've got a lot of information here on different things. So we've got compute, which is virtual machines. That's the IIS offerings, different documentation on that. How to deploy with Eclipse, and I'm going to cover that in a little bit of detail in a few minutes. We've got data services, which is, I mentioned SQL Azure, SQL Server, we've got NoSQL, and we've got App Server, which is different applications that you might want to run on top of different platforms. Here you can download the SDKs for Windows, Mac, and Linux. So we do have Windows, and these SDKs are just like the Java SDK in a lot of ways. I'm sorry, the Java JDK in a lot of ways, but basically they allow you to interact with different platforms. So if you want to write a Java Mac application that accesses Windows Azure services, you can download our Mac version of this.
So those are client SDKs?
Yes, yeah, they're client SDKs, and there is a web application component as well. So when you write a client, you can actually put it on a multi-tier web application to run as well. We've got reference docs here for access. So someone was asking about the services. What do these SDKs actually do? You can work with access control, blobs, media services, queues, mail through SendGrid, service bus, run times, management, SQL databases, table service, and several other things. And the documentation is actually pretty extensive and pretty good. You've also got a technical library here, which breaks down a lot of different tasks. Talks about recent releases, all kinds of things. Down here, there's the Eclipse. I'm going to switch back to my presentation here. So the Java Developer Center. One of the things I want to tell you about as well, we've got different forum options. So Stack Overflow actually has a lot of information on Azure right now, so peer-reviewed responses to different questions. We were just on there earlier looking at some things about Memcached. By the way, the Java SDK doesn't handle Memcached interface. Also MSDN, of course, we've got for searching as well. Reference API documentation, as I mentioned. So the client API here, you've got different classes for handling different things. They're all very well documented with examples. Articles and updates, I showed you the documentation there. Windows Azure.github.com. Does anybody know about, perfect. Windows Azure on GitHub? I know you're on GitHub. But, okay, so yeah, Windows Azure on GitHub is actually a pretty good site. Pretty good resource if you want to get going with Windows Azure. There are several projects. Let's see. Actually, that's not where I want to go. GitHub, Windows Azure. There's a few for Java. And when I do this search, it does Java and JavaScript. It's a GitHub thing. But let me see here. So, for example, we got Node, we got Socket.io. Does anybody work with WebSockets? Socket.io Service Bus, so it allows you to connect to our Service Bus offering for Socket.io. There's the Azure SDK for Java. There's a bunch of Java samples if you want to start working with the SDK as well. I'm going to show you the Eclipse plugin in a second to give you some more ideas on things you can work
So
with.
the fact all this code is on GitHub means it's all open source.
It is open source, it's all freely available and shareable, and there is actually a lot of code on Java out there. So there's Java examples. For example, if you want to set up a media service that accesses blobs and does, full CRUD operation, you've got the code in there to do it.
So you do a lot of pull requests or anything like that?
Sorry?
What kind of pull request activity do you have on this?
I don't have any info on that, but in terms of, he was asking about pull requests from GitHub. I don't know if the stats are out there or not, but I'm sure.
People are able to offer changes and stuff like that?
Oh yeah, no, you can fork, you can contribute. We're totally open to that, by the way. Does anybody use the Java SDK? By the way, I've been asked to ask this.
I'm not sure. To access Azure.
To access Azure, yes. Nobody at all? Okay, because I asked some questions for people who are using it, so you just reminded me I need to ask that. But yes, you can fork. It's a full GitHub. It's a GitHub project. You can do pretty much anything you want. You can fork. You can contribute. You can create things.
I think I saw it said it's under the Apache license, if I'm not mistaken.
I believe so.
So,
It's actually
Yeah, the SDK for Java examples, for example. Let's see.
The concept here is all the SDKs for all different languages are all open source on here. And this is, the Windows Azure team manages this site, and that's why we're not intimately familiar with what's going on with pull requests and stuff. But I can tell you that there have been pull requests and there are features that are there because people contributing.
Yeah.
Details.
Yes, we do get feedback. And if anyone has any feedback, please do contact us. That's what we're here for, to engage the open source community and get things working. Now, so I wanted to mention. Okay. So it's sorry for this. So you can download the SDK for Windows Azure, or we have an Eclipse plugin that works really well as well. So I've got some screenshots here of installing the Eclipse plugin. I already installed it. So basically, everyone here probably knows how to install new software on Eclipse. So you just go to install new software. The URL is dl.msopentech.com/eclipse, and that'll get you the Windows Azure toolkit for Java. You can select all these items. We've got a JDBC driver. We've got package for Apache Qubit. Anybody work with Apache Qubit messaging? AMQP? No? Okay, so AMQP is a messaging platform. You've got that available. You've got access control services that work directly with Active Directory and what we call ACS on Windows Azure. You've got common plugins for Eclipse, and this is what I want to show you today. So you just go through, confirm, and installs. So what I'm going to show you today is creating a project and deploying it to Windows Azure with very little effort. So most of you, I assume, are familiar with, you create a Java application, you probably contact a systems administrator, negotiate what it's going to be, what the services are going to be, and you'll see this is a little bit easier. So what we did here is I created a project called CJUG. It's a dynamic web project. And I created it with a single JSP. And that index JSP just says, hello CJUG. So now I've finished my project. And you can do this, by the way, with any existing project in Eclipse. I finished my project. I want to test it. And if it works fine, I want to publish it out on Windows Azure and have it run.
So how did you get this far? You said you wanted a new project. What type of project did you tell me?
Oh, it's a dynamic web project.
Okay.
So I just went in and just went File, New, Project, Dynamic Web Project. And I just built this part because it was easier.
So far, there's nothing in here Azure or
Nothing Azure specific, yeah. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this project, and it just prints out, hello, CJUG.
Yeah, at least you could have done with a little applet or something right there.
I know, well, hey, it gives you an idea. I want to focus on the Azure functionality. So, okay. So anyway, new. Oh, sorry. We go down here. Once you've installed the Windows Azure plugin, you've got this thing that says Windows Azure, package for Windows Azure. You can also press this button up here, which deploys. And let's call this one SEAJ. Let's spell it right. J1. Okay, so CJUG 1. So we've got two different kinds of projects. I had a web deployment project. I'm sorry, dynamic web project. And with a single JSP that just says hello CJUG. Now what I'm creating is called a Windows Azure deployment project. You can see it up at the top here. The Windows Azure deployment project actually packages a web application server and packages your code that you've built and a JDK into a common storage facility that can then be published out to Windows Azure. So let me cover the options here. So when I hit next, it shows me the options I've got. I can put in whatever JDK I want. And in this case, I just picked the default, which is a JDK from this location, the latest JDK. When I'm in the cloud, this is something interesting. So let's say you have an application you built, and it depends on a certain Tomcat server and a certain JDK. But you want to deploy that from the web. This option here, you can say deploy from download. It'll actually, you can place your specific JDK in your specific application server out in Windows Azure in a blob. It could be a public blob, it could be a private blob that's secured only for this download purpose. And what you can do with that is leave it out there, and when you check this box, you would put in your information, a URL, and an access key for your Windows Azure blob, and it will actually, upon install of this application, take those things from the blob and put them out on Windows Azure. So it'll build a new role, they call roles, which I'll explain a little bit later, for Windows Azure. It will take that package from the blob and deploy it. It's faster that way because it's not coming from your local machine. It's also easier for distribution because obviously not everyone is going to have the right version of software on their local machine for publishing. So instead of requiring them to download everything, package it up, and send it up to Windows Azure or wherever you want to deploy it, you can actually go and get it from a blob and publish it that way. The next thing we want to do is we want to use a server to run this application. So we've got some code, we've got a JDK we depend on. Now we want to go out and get a server. And in this case, I've got Tomcat. I just say OK. Now it automatically filled in Apache Tomcat 7 for me. You can also use Glassfish, JBoss, or Jetty. And the different versions are there, the most recent versions. It automatically filled that Apache Tomcat in, so I know it's working. That's a good thing. All right, and then applications. In this case, we're just going to include the WAR file that's generated from Eclipse, hellocjug.war. Yeah?
Those were sets of web servers that you have on your machine that are in what format so that this deployment project knows how to grab one of them? What was that? Is that just a big WAR file, or was that?
It's not even a WAR file. It's just the actual file in a directory. Let me see.
As downloaded from the site, or from Megan?
Yeah, it's downloaded from Tomcat. So here it is. It's just this one, Apache Tomcat, Windows Zip, and all I did was unzip it and put it here in this location. And what it's going to do is when I publish this, it's going to package up that Tomcat server.
That too.
Yes, yeah. It'll package up the Tomcat server and the JDK that I specified here, and it's actually going to publish it along with this WAR file out to the web. So a couple things that you can do as well, and you can set these. Yes?
Yeah, I'm confused too. This is an alternative to the Linux machine you were showing us earlier with Tomcat on it. Is this going to go to your
It is
web servers?
totally different, totally different. So that was a Linux VM. It's already been predestined. It's been pre-configured. You can go and get that and put it on Windows Azure, but all you're going to have is an operating system, Linux, and a Tomcat server. You won't have the specific JDK. You won't have the code that you want to actually run. So in this case, I'm showing you a Hello World app, but you might have a really complicated application here. As long as it's in a WAR file, you can include it here and publish it out with your web server. Yeah.
I assume you can not check all those previous things and then push it onto one of these images that you grabbed from the other place and say, look, it's already got a Tomcat, it's already got a JDK, I just want to put my WAR file with it.
Well, then you wouldn't need this plugin, but yeah.
Well, I mean, it knows to remember the right URLs and the like,
Yeah, well, you can just publish a WAR file to Tomcat. Just put it in the applications directory, and off you go. But this is a way of publishing everything and packaging it together so it can be distributed. And here's a couple more things. So we've got session affinity. There's 3 different options here that are really important, which are features of the Eclipse plugin. So sticky sessions is session persistence, for everybody who knows. In the case of Windows Azure, when you deploy things, it actually gets deployed to different layers. One of the layers is your application layer, then you have a storage layer. The storage layers and the memcache layer actually as well can be on different servers. And you've got a network consolidation that distributes this and puts it on different servers depending on what your load balancing requirements are and what you've configured in your setup. Sticky sessions, it makes sure that session persistence is maintained on your application. So if a user logs into your application and starts his session on one server, he's going to continually be routed to that server until his session is complete. So that's what sticky sessions are. Caching is memcache compatible, high availability cache. So what we do is we create a specific facility, and I'll describe how that facility works for a little bit, for memcaching. So you can actually store information in memory, and it's a separate facility from your actual virtual server that you've got running. The virtual server itself has its own memory, but you might want to have caching memory aside from that so that you don't have to tax your server.
Now, is that, do we have to generate the logic to use that, or is that something automatic?
It actually enables it automatically.
So basically you would use standard memcache client, like Spy memcache is the one that we've been testing. So you just use that as your client library. You just hook it up to the servers. There's an endpoint basically created for you, port to the name, and that's what you hook it up to. And from that point on, you're just using it as if it's a memcache server behind the scenes. But in reality, it's a Windows Azure service that's acting as if it's a memcache server.
Yeah, okay. So you can choose caching. You can also choose remote debugging. What remote debugging is going to do, pretty straightforward. Instead of having to run everything locally and debug it, it'll actually make changes to your server instance of this. So in this case, I'm not going to check any of those. Just wanted to tell you about them, but I'm just going to hit finish. And all it does is create a new CJ1. And it's probably too small to see here, but there's a little A there on it, and that'll tell you that it's a Windows Azure deployment project. Now what I can do with this is I can actually run it in a local emulator. Like I said, what we're going to do is we're going to take a Java application, package it up, we're going to test it locally, and if we like the way it's working, we're going to publish it out to Windows Azure. So, in this case, all I have to do is hit this little button here, run in Windows Azure emulator.
What is that exactly?
The Windows Azure emulator is a local Tomcat server. It basically sets up an emulator, and you're going to see all kinds of boxes running here in a second.
So it's not it's not a separate VM. It's actually just Tomcat.
It's Tomcat, and it's your actual. It's basically everything that's going to run on Windows Azure. So it's an emulator that actually simulates our Windows Azure environment, including all the application facilities you've got, storage, network, memory, and also the application itself, and the Tomcat server, and the JDK. So everything is here specific for this particular package that we've created, this Windows Azure deployment package. So this is running now. I can see here, I can confirm it's running. Java EXE is running. This is what we call a worker role, and I'll explain what that is in a little bit. So I just want to show you the whole application conceptually, how it works, and then I'll explain how that actually makes things go. So, local Tomcat. There you go. So this is localhost 8080. It's automatically set up to run. Tomcat server 7037, the one that we just set up. And, whoops. And here. And the local demo. Demo. Oh, wait. Because I called it Hello C Jug. Hey, there we go. Real life example. So it's running on the local server. Obviously, it's not a very exciting app to see, but just want to make sure that you saw what it did to show you how it published to Windows Azure. So that's our local. What I can do here is now I'm done testing locally. Now I want to publish to Windows Azure. I'm going to stop the Windows Azure emulator. Now, somebody mentioned a little while ago, what does this actually run? And this is a good point. So if I wanted to try this, for example, with a 1.6 JDK or a version of something that's not Tomcat, I want to run a Jetty server, see if it's going to work on Jetty, I could actually create a new, with this same WAR file, create a new Windows Azure deployment project, set it up with JDK 1.6, 1.7, and then with Jetty, all these different things. You can try it in Eclipse to see if it's going to work on Windows Azure in the environments you want it to. It's kind of a cool way to test things. And you can create as many of these Azure projects you want for each dynamic web project, for example. So you have one WAR file. You can test it 20 different ways with 20 different Windows Azure deployment projects. In this case, I shut down the emulator. Now all I want to do is publish this to Windows Azure. So next, all we have to do for that is there's a little button up here, Publish to Windows Azure Cloud. And what you have to do is select the Azure deployment package, not the original dynamic web package. Because the Azure deployment package, as I mentioned, already has the JDK, the Tomcat, everything bundled together and ready to go. So if I hit Publish to Windows Azure Cloud, there's a couple things that happen here. I can import, I've already done this, so it's imported my information here, but I don't want to put it there. I want to put it in Benz Tomcat Demo Storage and Benz Tomcat Demo. So this actually has a bunch of drop downs. On Windows Azure, what you do is you set up a Windows Azure account, and when you're logged into Windows Azure, all you have to do is hit this Import from Published Settings file and select the file that you want to download. The actual file gets generated by Windows Azure using the credentials that you logged in your browser on. It brings them down to this publishing facility. Once you've done that, oh, and I should mention you've got staging and production. This is important because I'm going to show you a demo in a little bit, but staging and production on your Windows Azure instance as well. Yes?
Now, can you do this part for free?
Yes. Yeah, this part is free. Storage and running. So depending on what you're storing, Windows Azure bills you for what you store, what you use, bandwidth, and disk. And disk and bandwidth can take many different forms. You can have memcache. That's another charge for facility in terms of bandwidth is being used. Storage can be one local MongoDB, or it could be 40 instances of SQL Server out there running. A lot of different things you can have, but yes, it's charged based on what you use.
If you go to WindowsAzure.com, you can sign up for a 90-day free trial.
Yeah.
And that's throttled. You can't roll out a huge, active site with a big database for free. But just typical developer stuff, things like Brian's doing, or much more complex sort of demo, you can do that for 90 days for free. So you can kind of kick the tires that way. You just have limits on how much disk usage or bandwidth or compute you can use.
Okay, what do they want, an email account or something?
Yeah, you need email account. You have to, for the free trial, you have to have a credit card to sign up. You don't get charged anything for it, but that's part of the authentication mechanism is to prevent spam or whatever. We are looking into some other options for that right now. You have to provide a credit card, but you can use it for 90 days without spending anything.
And I just went through this because I joined in November, and I had a new account previous to that. But yes, they just run, and then they warn you several times during the trial saying, by the way, your services, they don't say you're going to be charged. They say your services will be cut off at the end of 90 days unless you agree to a new license and charges. So they do not charge you, but they do ask for a credit card. So it's, but I can tell you from personal experience, they don't charge anything, and they won't charge anything unless you allow them to afterwards, even though you gave your credit card in advance. It's a little confusing, but it's the
So if
way
we
they do
keep giving you credit cards, but we keep giving you definitely?
it. Well, yeah, but you'll lose everything that you had built in that previous session. So if you're building anything meaningful, I mean, my Windows Azure account these days, I have my own personal account. It's running me about $19 a month. It's, you know, it's reasonable. So anyway, so I was going to mention staging and production. You've got staging and production here for your target environments. Staging will give you a hidden URL. It's a set of numbers I'll show you in a minute, and allows you to just try things out without an easily findable URL. So the next thing you can do, remote desktop, as I mentioned, you can do remote work on this. Once you set it up, you go through Windows Remote Desktop, RDP, you can actually get into the server. What we're creating here is what's called a platform as a service worker role, and I'll get into what that is in a little bit. But you can actually RDP into these platform as a service worker roles just like any other server. You can manipulate the back end, the disks, and you can move things around, file system, and things like that. So I'm not going to hit publish here because when I do, it could take anywhere from 5. The Wi-Fi here is pretty slow, so I'm guessing it would be more like half an hour. But typically in the office, it takes me about 5 minutes to publish something. So,
As small as 1 JSP.
yeah, well, it's just 1 JSP. Yes, good point, but it's all based on bandwidth. So, if you
The
have
next time we change one letter, it will be again the same process. There is no optimization, like, okay.
That's why you run it locally, sir.
well, that's why you run it locally and test.
Google App Engine, for example, is intelligent. It just delivers the diff.
Oh, well, there you go.
So I'm just running through this stuff.
That's a good question.
Passing the whole JDK.
You are passing a whole JDK each time. I think this app, when it gets done, is a few meg, you know, so it's the JDK plus Tomcat plus your WAR file and some packaging in there, which I'll get into in a little bit.
It
Yeah.
sounds like it's your option to specify by URL existing JDK or existing Tomcat instances that are already been set up in Azure.
Yes, yeah, you can.
So you don't necessarily have to upload your WAR with everything while you only do infrastructure.
And that is an excellent point to bring up the blob storage. So you remember before we had that option when we were building the application of putting things when in cloud instead of including the package deploy from. That's exactly why we have that feature. So it'll already be out on the web. It doesn't have to go through your local bandwidth. It's already been out there. You've already pre-decided this is the Tomcat server and the JDK that works with this app. So it'll actually just deploy the code into your Windows Azure instance, and it'll go out to the blob out on the web and pull all those things to the blob. Much more efficient for bandwidth locally and much more predictable in terms of.
And can you also customize that? So you wanted to put in like a custom config or something like, you know, a user that you want to have for your app that's enabled by default or something like that. So can you actually, that you're pointing to, you can actually configure that how you want to.
Inside Eclipse, yes, and I'll show you the configuration for doing that. There's a few different options there, and it's, you know, it's limited, but I'll show you the different options you have for deploying like that. Most of that you want to put alongside your code, but I know what you mean, like INI settings you want to include, environment variables, things like that, yes. You can.
I do have another question though. So you showed the plugin that you guys have for Eclipse there, you know, you created a new dynamic web application project with it. and it created a certain file structure and some libraries and stuff that it was including by default, it looks like.
Yeah.
Most projects that I work with, Maven is my sort of tool of choice.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I use that for everything.
We use it to build the Java SDK. Yeah.
So if I go with the dynamic web application, option to create a project, and say if I don't want to use that, and I want to use Maven, how does that fit into the whole deploying from your desktop or Eclipse into Azure?
It looked like it just, the output of your project was merely the resulting WAR file.
Right.
So however you got that together, that was your problem. And then the Azure project deployable, that's why it's a separate project. It keeps the task of putting it together.
That's sourcing it though, right?
Yeah, but that's probably depends on another project link to the other project's workflow.
Was it? Is that what
The
it is?
Azure deployment project is really just a shell, just a delivery vehicle, and you're stuck into Windows Azure. In fact, we kind of added some Java-specific options to it, but in reality, you can deploy theoretically anything with that thing.
Okay.
Just made it optimized for Java simply because, well, it's meant for Java, but there's nothing Java-specific inside of it other than like, yeah, there's some environment variables, yeah, we understand what a JDK means, what a server means, but there's no pre-made code that does anything with Java.
So you could have an Ant project, Maven project,
You're ready to deploy whatever you want to deploy, as long as you know how to
As long as it's in that other project somewhere, you can find it, I guess.
Yeah, I was going to show you this later, but there is, there are some resources for this. I'll show it to you later. But they're basically XML files that get generated along with your code. It packages everything together. So deployment is really boring, and once I hit that next button, it just goes through, and down here at the bottom you can see it's deploying to staging and production. From there, you can actually just log into Windows Azure. This is the Windows Azure dashboard. This is my Benz Tomcat demo. In production, we've got nothing right now. In staging, remember I said there's two different URLs. Production has a certain URL, which would be bbenstomcat.cloudapp.net. In this case, our URL, because it's staging, looks like this. So when I click on that, open a new tab, it opens up a new Tomcat for me, so same thing. And then the server demo in case, let's do that one. Hello, secret. Nope.
Well, you didn't deploy, so right? Or did you already deploy?
Oh yeah, this one, oh you're right, yeah, thank you. Duh, yeah. I didn't deploy this, so this is the old one that I did. This is the one I did previous. This is the one that's actually deployed out on Benz Tomcat. I could have used that one, I could have deployed it. It'd probably take about half an hour with the Wi-Fi here to get it out there, and then it would overwrite what I have there. But
why couldn't you just plot your little index in your little index in your local Tomcat?
You already ran it locally. He wants to get it.
oh no, yeah, I ran it locally. So just to be clear, so we ran locally, we tested the emulator, and then I published it. I pretended to publish. Sorry.
On Azure, on your server, your
Yeah.
Tomcat server, can't you just plot your little index file or whatever you had there, your LLC job?
Yeah, you have to deploy the whole thing.
So there's this, we should have mentioned, there's a key difference between that infrastructure as a service offering versus platform as a service. The infrastructure, the VM depot, all those images, that's literally you managing your images. You have an image, that's one image, one instance, you own it. Whereas platform as a service, this stuff for Eclipse, what you get is a cluster, you can arbitrarily scale that out. So if you want 10 instances, Azure automatically takes care of it. You want 100 instances, you want 2 instances, so that management of it is automatic in that. That's why you have to go to the effort of describing your deployment in order for Azure to understand, oh, okay, this is how you scale this thing, as opposed to an image, which is just your own standalone VM.
Yes, sir.
You deployed that to a Windows VM.
It's deployed to a Windows instance of Windows Azure.
Can you do a Linux equivalent of Linux, in which case you'd send up a Linux JDK, or is it just Windows, because it's Windows?
On the infrastructure as a service offering, you can put it on Linux, but in the platform as a service, which is what I'm going to cover right now, it's only Windows. So it runs on Windows 2008 or 2012, that it runs on this. So what did we just see? So We publish something out to the cloud. So what I want to explain to you now is where this actually went when it was published. Roles and instances. So platform as a service. As I mentioned before, you've got several things that Windows Azure manages and several things you manage. Right up to the OS level is what Windows Azure manages in this case, and then you manage the applications. Roles are a hosted service. That's what in the cloud world we call an instance, a service. It's called a role. And runtime, they each execute, and I'm going to show you how you configure those and things in a minute. So what can it run? If it runs on Windows, it runs on these pass roles. Any kind of code here, and it can be combined, Java, C#, VB, C++, etc., can run, choice of frameworks. It's pretty flexible in terms of what you can put out there in terms of for platform as a service. So there are two different kinds of roles we have in platform as a service. There's a worker role, which is what we're working with now. And a worker role is something that runs on Windows Azure, and it processes things. We also have a web role, which has a built-in web server. In this case, we don't want a web server because we're going to run Tomcat as a web server, so we use a worker role. So roles and instances. So when I loaded this up onto Windows Azure, I can now configure this to do all kinds of things. Right off as soon as you install this and start it up, you've got a network load balancer that's actually working with your roles, and these roles can be managed in multiple domains. By default, they call them the locally redundant nodes. So when you put something in a disk by default locally, you get 3 instances of that automatically. That's your minimum. So the network load balancer here will handle the front end. So when I go out here and I do something like this, it's actually doing a whole bunch of stuff behind the scenes in Windows Azure. It's got some storage, it's got network load balancers, it's incredible overkill for this application, but if you needed it, it's there. You've got a minimum of 3 locally redundant nodes for each application.
So did you just deploy all 3?
Yes, yeah. So what it does is it puts the network load balancer. That's why I was asking if everybody's a developer or an administrator. This is your administrator. It automatically handles scalability and things for you. Now you have to pay for it, depending on what you use. And here's another feature. So if a node goes down, in this case, domain 3 went down, it will automatically replicate those nodes into another location, so that you're basically not going to lose any data, and you won't even notice that a node went down. And this can be geolocated, so if we have a natural disaster somewhere, your data is still covered in another location. It can also be locally located as well. And I'll show you that in a minute. So you've got your network. This is everything that's behind the scenes in what we just loaded. Intelligent network, load balancer. You've got stateless web. You've got worker machines, which is what we just published to. You've got activation here. These all can be different VMs. So you can have a queue for a virtual machine. You can have a relational database or a shared file system on a blob or in a table. So all these things can be managed behind the scenes and connected together. And these can be automatically configured. Somebody was asking about how would you actually, Nimrod was asking about how would you actually package these to configure and deploy a default user or something like that. That's done through the service definition and service configuration files. And they're both XML files, and they're encrypted and published along with your Azure code. There's a default that gets generated by the Eclipse plugin, and that goes out there, but you can actually manipulate it behind the scenes as well. It's an advanced topic, but it's there and you can do it. So you can actually define roles, ports, certificates, X509 certificates if you've got a third-party SSL that you want to put out there for your site. You can do that as well. And the service definition can be changed just by upgrade, so you have to publish again out to Azure. Server configuration has runtime values, so anything you want to set in your INI files, environment variables, associated virtual VHD files. Those can be published at any time, and then you just restart your worker role instance. You've also got networking. Some of the features for networking is security. So you've got input endpoints, so you can actually set up specific endpoints. So if you want to link, for example, a multi-tier application to a relational database, or you want to feed data into a relational database, you can set up endpoints for that. And actually services as well, like Service Bus. So we'll cover that in a little bit. Name resolution, load balancing behavior. So as I mentioned, you've got a network load balancer built into a platform as a service offering. And that can be actually configured and managed. And what can you configure and manage? I'll show you in a minute. For example, here's an example. So upgrading an application. If you want to upgrade an application, so say Tomcat 1.8 comes out. You want to upgrade your application, but you don't want to affect any users. So as I mentioned, you've got your staging. Where is your... Oh, there it is. You've got your staging and your production environments built into each worker role that you deploy. In this case, you want to do an in-place upgrade. You can use your network load balancer, and you can configure this through those XML files, or it can be automatic, to actually process production. Production won't be touched. You take your package, the new package actually gets in, upgrades and the staging, and you switch to staging, then you upgrade your production, and make that your staging for a moment, just swap them, and that will automatically be upgraded without any downtime. So hopefully that's it. Yeah.
What about sticky sessions? Will it migrate over, like for people that are already on it, or how would it handle that scenario?
That's a good question. Yes, it will actually. It will handle the sticky sessions in that.
Not after upgrade. Sticky session is just for the just the lifetime of that session.
Okay, I thought it would swap the production with staging.
The session is not smart.
Okay.
So
the answer is no for that particular moment.
So what's the user experience in that case? I mean, do they just get chopped and
You just get all that out of the
okay, new session.
Just have to warn people that at 4 a.m. they're going to upgrade.
Or just do it.
Yeah, in general, if you're not using sticky sessions, so you can actually upgrade and the users will never know. So, good question. So virtual machines. So we covered the PaaS, what they're called platform as a service worker role. That's what I showed you. Everything gets published out to there. Virtual machines as well. There is portability with those, as I mentioned. You've got Windows Azure. You can put it in your data center. So if you've got Windows running in your data center or something that handles VHD files, then you can actually deploy directly to Windows Azure. You can deploy from Windows Azure to your data center as well. So you can actually have an on-premise option for this.
So this is the infrastructure version?
Yes, infrastructure as a service. So I'm just describing a little bit more about, so we covered platform as a service. Now I'm just going to cover infrastructure as a service. One of the important features is this on-premise and Windows Azure. Yeah.
Back to the platform as a service, you mentioned RDP. If you RDP to one of your instances, are you seeing, if you make a change on that instance, is that replicated across all of the different nodes, or how does that work?
Good question. No, well, so you have to create an RDP for each backend instance. But yeah, if you're working with multiple instances, that's a whole separate topic, but it does get tricky when you're working with multiple instances in RDP. It'll just go to your single instance for now and update your production instance, but not necessarily staging. I'm sorry, I said that the wrong way. It'll update your staging instance, but not necessarily your production. So, Windows Azure. So you can go to other service providers as well with the virtual machines, as long as they support the VHD format. And there's no lock-in for those virtual machines. One of the things I want to show you, so the storage, as I mentioned, by default, you get 3 locally redundant nodes when you set up any service. And this is just all the disk behind the scenes. So not only do you have the multiple instances in a worker role, which are configured as scalable, We also have this locally redundant node. So if a locally redundant node goes down, it swaps the disk automatically and automatically spins up a new disk for you. It's a persistent drive. It's reliable and always on. And you can actually do geo-replication as well. It's not on by default, but if you want to, you can actually replicate I think all the data centers are 20 miles apart at least. And we also have data centers in multiple countries. So we have West US, East US, and Europe, and we have a couple of Asian data centers as well. So you can actually swap geographically as well, yes.
How does that work with your database tables?
It replicates it. It automatically replicates it. First locally, through the locally redundant nodes, and then geolocation as well. And you can specify, for example, for regulatory purposes, if you have a limit on where you can actually replicate your data, let's say not to Asia, or not to Europe, or not to the US. If you're in Europe, you can do that as well. You can actually control where that actually gets replicated. But just to give you an idea of what's behind the scenes. So you can put this thing out on a past worker role or a VM, and there's all these facilities available to you. As I mentioned before, mem caching. So we've got distributed cache. Just a little image here, little animation. So you've got 300 megs of cache on each server as part of your application server, but maybe you don't want to use that. You can actually create a separate worker role and create its own shared caching, and this is memcached compatible. In that case, and it's completely scalable. You can have 12 gigs cache for 2 servers. You can have 48 gigs, so you have 24 or 48. You can actually just swap out. You can swap out as much as you want in terms of cache. So the idea there with that little animation is just to show you your application server is not the only place you can have memcaching. You can have a shared memcaching service, which is separate from your instances as well.
Question.
Yes.
What's the latency to access information in that cache there? I mean, is it like local in memory, or is it, you know?
It's in memory. It's not local though, but it's highly available, and you can actually bring up and you can actually spin up and bring down memory. Yes.
Yeah, it's in memory on those instances. It's a typical memcache implementation, so it's very fast.
So it depends on where you're deployed. If you're deployed within the same instance as the application, and obviously that gives you the best performance. If you're deployed outside, well, there's going to be a little bit of latency because of the connectivity, but it's not.
Well, I'm just wondering, because I mean, when you have 48 gigs of memcache data, I mean, am I literally using a machine or a couple of machines in the Azure data center that are 48 gigs of RAM?
It's going to be your call basically to figure out what sort of user performance goals are.
You're using multiple machines, but it looks like one contiguous cache.
Right.
It's an abstraction.
And it can be separate from your application server as well. So you can have a separate memcached instance that runs independently of your applications as well.
How big the pipe between the external memory and my application? How much bandwidth? What's the latency? What's the guarantee?
A good question. I don't have an answer for that one in terms of milliseconds or anything like that, or nanoseconds. But it is, the idea is it is more performant. I'd have to find out. And by the way, it's different between different data centers. We have some data centers that have faster caching.
I guess we can assume it's faster than disk.
Sorry?
I guess we can assume it's faster than disk.
Yeah, we can assume it's faster than disk. How much faster, or what is the actual stats on it, I'm not sure. Sorry. I can get that.
Yeah, the AWS guys were here, what, like months ago or something, and there were a lot of people complaining about not having any control over the contention with other customers on the same hardware was causing people a lot of anxiety.
Okay.
And so we're sort of asking you the same questions we asked them, but
right.
But yeah, a lot of people were struggling with AWS with some other process would spool up and steal on my CPU, or I really didn't have the bandwidth between the two machines that they told me I would have.
Okay, well, I can tell you, in ours, it is isolated.
Mm-hmm.
Our worker roles are isolated, and when you create a new Memcache facility, if it's a shared cache, it is a new worker role, and that is segmented as well. So you shouldn't be sharing spindles or anything like that with these guys, and the same with memory.
Okay, but network. So they're VMs on I assume large hypervisors, though, right? So, I mean, are they oversubscribed? Because it sounds like the AWS ones are. I couldn't tell you. I don't think if AWS is, I couldn't tell you. I don't think we're oversubscribed though. So yeah.
We wish we were.
Yeah, sure.
It's a good problem to have.
One of the nice things as well with Azure is we have this thing called Enterprise Graph REST API. And we have another thing called ACS, which is 100% compatible with Active Directory. 93% of the big companies use Active Directory, so you can have identity management through things that are already available to people in large enterprises. Service bus, I just want to mention this real quick. Service bus, we've got secure messaging, basically, and the idea here is using some of the new features with AMQP, the Cupid, as I mentioned earlier, Apache Cupid and things. You can have a cloud application and a mobile application, and you can have some data behind a firewall and through message queuing. In our service bus, it's just a facility to help you share that data. Yes?
So did you go back to platform again, or is this the infrastructures?
This is actually platform. I'm sorry. Thanks, good catch. So this particular
services that you can use. I mean,
right.
Regardless of where your application is run.
Yeah, that's a good point. So virtual machines, platform as a service, IaaS, PaaS, you can actually use these services. These are Azure services, identity, service bus that you can use with any application. Yeah. Think of it like one big server. And that's what I really like about it is you can just focus on your application, and then you can think, oh, I'm going to need a service bus. What do I do? Okay, there's a service bus service. You can pull that into your application. Yes?
So if I use these, then how would the simulator work? Like how would when you run the application work?
Oh yeah, that's a good question. Well, Eclipse, it won't run. I mean, it won't run. It won't run a service bus for you. You'd have to do that.
If my web server, if I have a Word application.
Yeah. Okay, so if you're running Eclipse, right, you're going to build an application that accesses a certain endpoint on Windows Azure with your service bus. You can test that locally and see if it works, and then you publish it to Windows Azure. Just like you would.
I have a public test version of that running.
Of that meaning the service bus?
The service that you're calling.
Yes. Yeah, you'd have to have the front end, and you'd have to have the service bus running.
I mean, the emulator doesn't emulate all of Windows Azure, right? The emulator just emulates your deployment within your little bubble.
Right.
JDK, but there are external services such as service bus. For storage, there happens to be a storage emulator as well. I'm not sure that was a great choice, but there is a storage emulator. But for all the other services, identity, service bus, all the other things, well, those are services that are running independently within Windows Azure. We fall into them sort of from outside, from inside, but you're outside of the emulator.
You can call them from Eclipse, and when you put the application on Azure, it's still going to call.
They're just services.
Yes. Go ahead.
I'm losing track of all the arrows connecting all the boxes virtually and otherwise.
I do that too, yeah.
Back on the identity, compatible with Windows, whatever it's called, the
Active Directory.
Active Directory, yeah, thank you. How does the machine somewhere in Azure get involved in your Active Directory inside your corporation? I know the browser can pass some information through. Hey, this guy is Paul at mycompany.com, or in some domain in Active Directory. But how does that happen? It comes back to my corporation.
Beyond the scope of our.
It's getting a long time. This is a beer topic, but it's actually it actually connects connects to this thing called ACS. So it's like Active Directory, but it actually connects through secure channels to go out and get. It's like a VPN for your Active Directory.
Oh, it sneaks back to you, it does sneak back to your corporation and asks the questions, who's doing it?
Yes.
The scenario we're trying to enable there is a big enterprise. You spend a lot of time investing in how you configure your Active Directory, and we got this class of users who have these rights, this class of users has those rights, plus a few others, minus a few others, and all that kind of stuff. And the whole point of ACS and Active Directory on Azure is to make it easy to just export all that to your cloud apps that you're building, and without having to build a separate infrastructure for all that. You've already set up how you look at user rights, and now you can enforce those in your cloud apps.
You said export, I assume that means you're synchronizing it up into the cloud.
Correct.
Yeah, you're keeping the guys up in the cloud up to date on what your internal Active Directory is about in some backdoor media.
Yeah, and we're at the outer edge of my understanding of the black magic involved. But
There's things like stubs and things like this that's a totally, that can probably all be its own session.
Actually, yeah, exactly. Active Directory, there's a lot of stuff happening in that space, and I think it's far beyond what we were. There's a lot of things.
Draw a big arrow in a big box. It's okay.
So I'm going to wrap this up. It's getting late, but I'm just going to go through SQL database real quick. Yeah.
Yeah, before we close, I had a quick question. You mentioned earlier as far as data science, what, for example, do you support Julia? Do you support, some of the, these things, data mining, the data science?
Put a worker box together with anything.
Well, you mean like things like R or
R?
Yeah, R for business intelligence stuff. Yeah, I mean, it's an open source. It works on Windows Azure. It doesn't, you don't host it on Windows Azure though, but it would run on several different ways. You can put it on a virtual machine. There's all kinds of ways that you can run it. But let's talk about that later. Let me get through these last few slides. You guys are probably get a little tired. So the SQL database. So I just want to tell you a little bit about storage. So we talked about services. We also have storage facilities. There's a SQL database, which everybody knows. We also have blob storage, which is basically file system storage, and it allows you to do things like media. The blob storage that we have on Windows Azure starts with an account. So you set up an account. You've got containers. These containers contain blobs, and these blobs contain videos, pictures, etc., etc. You've got blobs that are page blobs, and you've got blobs that are block blobs. Block blobs are used for storage and archiving, and you address them by saying we start at this bit and we end at this bit. Page blobs are easily identified. They're more for interaction, highly interactive sites, and they're more like pages. You can refer to pages and use them for consistency. So that's just a blob storage. I want to show you a little bit about, you access them through URLs, URIs. You've got accounts, containers, blob names. Through the dashboard, you can see things like your availability of your blob, how many things have been successfully uploaded, downloaded, total requests, and continuous availability. There is if you go out to windowsazure.com to the Developer Center, there's a whole topic on blob details, but I just want to give you a little bit about what you would do with Java to get to a blob. So this is part of the Java SDK. You import a couple of classes here, storage and blob client. Now what I'm going to do here is this is just a 12-line piece of code that's going to go out and look at a blob, open it up, open a container, and list off all the blobs in that container. So here we are, we're at the account level here. We're going to go using the connection string that we saw in the previous animation. I'll go real quick now, sorry. But the connection string there, you provide a storage account and a storage account key, which actually gets provided to you when you create an account. You can download it and plug it in here. All you have to do then is reference a container, or you can create a container that doesn't exist. And then basically you can output just by a quick for. It's going to go out and get the blobs with the list blobs function. The list blobs class that basically prints out any blobs down at this level. So that's the kind of thing that you can do with the SDK, just to give you an idea sorts of things besides publishing things to Azure. You can interact with blobs, tables, services, service bus, identity, things like that. It's all built into the SDK, and the documentation is out there. So getting started, as I mentioned, and Doug mentioned earlier, there's a 90-day free trial, and like I say from personal experience, they don't charge you anything for it. They'll warn you when they're gonna stop or you agree to pay, but for 90 days it's totally free. One of the other things, on Channel 9, there's this thing called Azure Conf, and this is a video of Scott Guthrie, Scott Gu, our VP at Microsoft for Windows Azure, and he's got a really good, really quick overview of all the different facilities in Windows Azure. I focused on Java, he focuses on the general coolest things. It's a 1 hour, 20-minute video. It's well worth the time spent on having a look at that. And that is it. We'll leave it there. Oops. And take some more questions. Yes?
So on the, let's say like Java by itself,
yeah.
Do you have any idea like how many people are using the infrastructure, how many people are using platforms to deploy applications, what is
we don't have those numbers, but in terms of, I would say it's a lot more infrastructure than platform right now.
Well, it depends on I guess it depends on the use case. Because for Java, we've had the platform as a service stuff for a long time, like the past 2 years. So I would expect just because of that history, there are a lot of people on that. The IIS part came out pretty for real only maybe a few months ago, so it's probably just newer. So it depends, but it's hard. I don't think we have the exact statistics at this point.
Yeah, and we don't really. Windows Azure has those numbers, so we don't have those numbers. Yes.
So I'm curious, your group is responsible for the first part of the show, right? Primarily of the responsibility, and Azure is just a platform you can work with it.
Correct. So
open technologies.
So Microsoft Open Technologies, we deal with all the different platforms that that you can use, including a lot of open source packages as well.
We do a lot of things separate from the cloud in Azure. But if you just look within Azure, what our group does, we make open source technologies work better on Azure. That's kind of our mission. So in this case, like the Eclipse plugin, that's one of the things our group has built. And if you look around on WindowsAzure.com, there are tutorials about using MongoDB or CouchDB or Solar or other things on Azure. So in those cases, our group gets involved in sometimes contributing code or funding a vendor who contributes code to some open source code base to make it work better in Azure. A lot of open source projects have kind of accidental hard dependencies on MySQL, let's say, as opposed to just generic SQL anything, or a Linux file system, which makes them not work well with NTFS. So we help eliminate those sorts of dependencies, and in an ideal engagement, we do those things in a way that it doesn't affect anybody who's already using that open source technology. It just means now it will also run well on Azure.
Right.
So that's kind of what we do broadly in the Eclipse plugin. Our group built that.
And devices. We work a lot with devices as well.
Yeah,
so not just Azure.
A bunch of non-Azure stuff you do too.
Yeah. So yes.
I was confused by what you were saying there. So I thought you're running Linux VMs on
Windows Azure.
He was talking about using NTFS versus using the Linux file system.
Sorry, there's two things going on. What did you just say?
Why is NTFS involved if they're Linux VMs?
On PASS, on all the cloud services, workflow stuff, those are all running on Windows boxes.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay, so you told us there was it's a charge for what you use.
Yeah.
And we deployed in PASS a Tomcat of JK and an application. What are we being charged? This space for those three things? And how do people hit it?
Yeah, exactly.
Is that it?
And it depends on the size. So if you choose a micro, there is a pricing calculator, right?
Yeah.
The number of machines, it's the amount of storage.
That to each other, per hour charges.
Yes.
There, yeah, the alternative is to be on an
There's a very slick interactive pricing calculator here. We can just move sliders to say how much storage, how much compute, et cetera.
This is the one?
Let's see, is this, yes, this is the one. So just drag some of those sliders. Yeah.
Oh, I see.
There. Yeah,
So for example, here's an example. So,
drag them over.
yeah, so you've got different, well, there we go, yay. You know, small, medium, large, you've got, you know, one VM, you've got SQL database storage, and you've got bandwidth here. It does just basically, and there are 3 different tiers. So small is a small VM, it allocates a certain CPU for you as a minimum. And then anything you add on to that costs more. A medium, same thing. And then SQL database itself does that as well, and bandwidth. And don't forget, this is not constant bandwidth. This is actually it is. It's calculating constant bandwidth, but you might not have that. You know, 3 in the morning, you might not have the same bandwidth as 3 in the afternoon. So, yeah.
So, you know, like Amazon Web Services is very much self-service. You go on the website.
Right.
Do what you want. Is the Azure like that or more like IBM style, where there's not a handful of solutions?
Yes, to both actually. So infrastructure as a service, IaaS, is you're on your own. Okay, really.
Do you have like solution architect that goes to a company and helps them figure
No,
it out?
we don't really do the IBM model. I mean, there's MCS, Microsoft Consulting Service, been around for years, but just as a general rule, we are providing an Azure platform here. IBM is very much a services company. If you just look at their P&L, they make all their money off hourly rates of people out there on
There's
site.
no such thing for
And yeah, we're just not that kind of a company. And so with this, we have the IaaS offering that is exactly like what Amazon's doing, and we're competing head-to-head there on just hosting VMs. And this kind of gets back to your question about why would you move from, if you're happy with what you run on EC2, why would you put it on Azure? If you're just going to take the same VM, the same bits, and redeploy it, I have to be honest, we don't have a good sales pitch for you before I do that. You need some other reason to do it.
Yeah.
But with the PaaS side of things, that's what we do that Amazon doesn't do anything like that. And that's where, as Mark was describing, you build your deployment for a single node, and then that can just scale out to 100 nodes really fast, or scale back down as your usage, spikes and so on.
Right, I mean, the typical IT model is, okay, I got my app ready to deploy, let's go have a week of meetings to figure out what to do.
Spin up extra VMs.
This is sort of,
okay,
yeah.
Let me add a couple other things to that. With PaaS, we do things like auto-patch the OS. So you're running your PaaS deployment, you've got 3 nodes running, there's a critical security update that comes out, your users never even know about it, those get patched one at a time, and this all happens behind the scenes. So there's a lot of little things like that that are going on in their PaaS.
I don't think you do that. Oh, you just demonstrated that we have to package JDK. So you do not patch JDK.
Well, we don't. We don't patch JDK.
Not the
There
application
are
specific
critical
OS
security
itself.
updates necessary.
Everything down the stack. Back in the first slide where there was.
Yeah, where's that slide here?
So, and now just to Google App Engine more so.
So this is the platform. So IaaS, this is Amazon. This is us. So we handle the OS. Okay. I'm sorry, for the OS, we can actually manage the OS, or it can be managed. We manage the OS. That's wrong. And middleware runtime. So JDK would be considered runtime, and same with the Windows. With the Tomcat server. Those would be runtime. So that's the kind of thing that you would manage on your PaaS offering. We also have Windows Azure websites, which is a basic, and it doesn't really involve Java that much, but you can set up a PHP server or something like that. It's typically a website, and you don't manage PHP or anything. You just manage the code on that application.
So you manage PHP, you don't manage Java. So security updates for PHP,
yes.
You do, but not for Java.
Correct.
Not much of a service, right?
PHP is a much simpler thing to do.
Yeah, PHP is much
for
simpler.
us techies, but there are other, shall we say, other trades that look at Oracle, look at the kinds of things that go on there. PHP has none of those issues. PHP's clean. We can all get together and do anything we want with PHP all day. We'll probably never meet a lawyer we don't already know. So there's a whole different world with Java. It makes it a lot more complicated for everybody.
An upgrade to Java. Would you really want us to upgrade your JDK on the weekend, and you come back on Monday and your app's not working because there's something deprecated? Or
as an option, I want to deploy my application in a managed environment. That's why I want to pay money.
Yeah, in the Java world, I mean, if you just look broadly across all the cloud providers, PHP, Node, other technologies are pretty easy for everybody to support. Java is more complicated. I think you've had
just to
questions
follow up,
sometime.
you answered a question I had in my mind, which was how do you handle Windows updates? It sounds like you can do it in the background. But
as platforms and services.
Correct.
Platform service we do
and
always.
Azure. But can you stop that? Because occasionally, to give you a chance, like in a staging area to test it? Because we've had situations
That's a great
where...
question. No, you can't stop it. But you have control. You can do a bunch of things. You can say when you're going to let it happen, and you write on-start, non-stop code. So you can write custom code that says, whenever you, Mr. Azure Platform, need to shut down one of my nodes, always do this, this, and this first before you gracefully shut that one down. You have a lot of control of how it works. But the basic premise here is we're not going to let certain past nodes get out of date or have security vulnerabilities. That's kind of part of our commitment for the past platforms, just take care of it.
And the past is not done by you guys, it's done still by the Azure tool, or is the past done by you?
Yeah, let's see, our team does various things to enable open source right on Azure, but we're not involved with the Azure platform. There's a whole very large organization of Microsoft.
Right, so we handle standards, interoperability, and open source, and we're the group that evangelizes it. We also have a group that sits on standards bodies and works with people to make sure everything works together. Yes?
So you kind of demonstrated the Eclipse sort of tools for creating projects, deploying them, and all that stuff. Are there corresponding command line tools for some of us that work on the command line or do automation and stuff like that?
Yes, there are. There's if you go to Windows Azure, there's the multi-platform command line tools, and those are good to know about.
It's not as rich for Java yet. We're working on that. For Java, we have some ant extensions. In fact, the Eclipse plugin is built around an ant, for that matter, just the thing that uses it as an ant extension. And that's pretty much all we have today. But this is, everybody knows that this is something that's interesting. So we're thinking about how can we enable more command line scenarios for Java developers.
The command line tools that you mentioned, command line, those are built by our group, MS OpenTech, and those tools let you manage virtual machines, IaaS, also PaaS deployments, also Windows Azure websites from Windows, Linux, or Mac workstations. So the idea is you can have an deployment where you have a bunch of Linux VMs running on the Windows Azure platform, and you're managing those from Mac and Linux desktops, and you have no Windows on the client or server involved at all. So it's a good example of the kinds of thing our team does, because when we collectively, all Microsoft, will get rolling out virtual machine support, we realized we don't want it to be the case that you'd have to have a Windows box to manage all that. That's kind of crazy. So our team built those tools to make all that possible.
So do you leverage platform-specific technologies for that? So I assume you're using PowerShell on Windows then?
PowerShell. Well, it's a little confusing here. There are PowerShell commandlets for Windows that existed before these command line tools we're talking about came along. These command line tools are node-based. So really they run on anything that runs node. Is the way to look at it. And they're open source. You can get the code for them. But they're a bunch of node commandlets, basically.
So you could leverage those to do things like, just monitor your cluster or your service, and if it hits a threshold or something.
Let's see, not like monitoring. These are about starting and stopping deployments and copying things.
But can you tie that into some sort of tripwire or monitoring system or something like that, so that you can have it automatically provision things, and spikes?
Not sure.
It's easy to for you to develop, because everything that we can do for the tooling is available through RESTful APIs in Windows Azure.
Okay.
So all of this is So even whenever the Java SDK, the client libraries, even if they don't cover something, you're going to find it in the RESTful layer, so you can talk to it. That's where classes are. Yeah, absolutely.
So, yeah.
What about SQL access from Java?
SQL access from Java?
Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. There's I showed the blob storage, but there's also a whole library for SQL access. And you're talking about SQL being able to pass SQL commands to.
Does it work through JDBC?
Yeah, I think you guys.
JDBC, yes. It has full facilities for that. You've also got, you can also create tables, drop them, everything through the.
Is that like the official JDBC driver for SQL
Yes.
Server from Microsoft?
This is the usual one. Yes, it works with SQL Server and SQL Alert. It's the same one.
And it's almost 1:45, and I know the parking garage closes at 9. Do they validate parking here?
Yes, for the first hour they do.
Oh, okay. So I think we'll wrap it up there. Anyone else who wants to continue this over beers, please do.
Thank you.
Join us.